The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian and thank you very much for tuning in again. No Janie this week as she's sadly been smitten with bronchitis, as one of my aunts used to call it. So Jane's normally dulcet tones sound more like
Kermit the Frog on helium.
What else is new? Well, I recently did an interview with Howard Hughes. No, not that Howard Hughes, but the UK radio journalist Howard Hughes for his weekly late-night show The Unexplained on UK Talk Radio. Anyway, it was a great interview, or more to the point, Howard was a great interviewer, and we talked about werewolf folklore, screaming skulls, no, it is a thing in Old English houses, and the legends of the Waveney Valley, which just so happens to tie in with a book I'm currently finishing off. And I was also particularly intrigued by the fact Howard described me as a man of paranormality. I rather like that. I'll add it to my CV and maybe give it as my occupation next time I renew my passport. Let's get on with the show. We have another of our practical magic spells, this time looking at how to create a simple good luck charm for safe travel. I'll also be looking at some leap year day folklore. However, our main event is the first episode of a 3-part interview with UFO abductee Terry Lovelace about his experiences both at the hands of aliens and the Men in Black. It's a fascinating tale that has its origins back in 1977, but then entered a second phase in 2012 when Terry, by now a retired Assistant Attorney General in the US Civil Service, discovered a mysterious implant in his right leg. As ever, we are totally non-judgmental and we leave it to you to form your own opinions about Terry's experience. Now this year, that's 2020, is a leap year, and we've just had February the 29th, which is a leap year day. And in case you're wondering how you calculate leap years, well, they happen every 4 years. However, the leap year has to be divisible by 400. So, for example, the year 1900 wasn't a leap year, but the year 2000 was. That's simple, eh? So what are the folklore traditions associated with leap year days? Well, the most widespread one is that the 29th of February is the only day on which women are allowed to propose marriage. And it's often also said that when the proposal is made, a man is not allowed to reject the proposal. And there's another story going back to Scottish law in the 13th century saying that if a man did turn down a proposal, they would be fined £100 for doing it. Sadly, that's a myth. No one's been able to find any existence of that legend of the fines. It's also said, similar flimsy evidence, that a man who refused such an offer from a woman to get married could only redeem himself by buying his proposer a new silk gown. However, the woman herself had to wear a red petticoat when making the proposal. So think about this, but basically, according to Steve Rood, who's the author of The English Year, National Customs and Festivals, he points out that if this was true, women would just have to buy a red petticoat, go around proposing to men, and in due course, given the good chance they might be turned down, they would collect a wardrobe full of silk gowns. good deal if you only have to buy a red petticoat. Anyway, the idea of the lady's privilege, there's no real origin for it, but there's a letter in 1606 which states that Chaucer wrote about it. So we're then going back a couple of hundred more years, and it says, "In leap year they have the power to choose, the men no charter to refuse." Yeah, well, still rather a bit in the fringe area. Adding to the legend side of things, there's also another explanation saying it's all down to St. Bridget or St. Bridie, the famous Irish saint, and St. Patrick. St. Bridget apparently complained to St. Patrick, saying it was unfair that women should not be allowed to propose. And Patrick was not quite so happy with this, so he said, how about that women are allowed to propose once every 7 years? However, Bridget bargained him down to once every 4 years. So there you have it. If you're a woman, it's the 29th of February. It is your opportunity to propose to a man, and he's not allowed to turn you down. Unfortunately, you've now missed this year, 2020, so you're going to have to hang on until 2024. Not that long. Now, here's the first part of our interview with Terry Lovelace. It's my very great pleasure to be talking to Terry Lovelace, and you have a fascinating saga to tell. I know you've told it before, but not to my audience, so if we can go through some of the details, and apologies for asking you questions you've been asked dozens of times before. But in a nutshell, basically you had an encounter some nearly 50 years ago, 45 years ago, 1977, and subsequently had some issues, but then got on with the rest of your life and went on to become a successful lawyer, but then had a return of issues relatively recently in October 2012. Would that be a quick summary about right?
That's a very accurate summation, Charles. And thank you for the invitation. I wanted to say it's my great pleasure to address your awesome audience here and share my story with them. I appreciate that opportunity.
No, I'm glad we got you on.
You know, the genesis of this story, well, of course, beside the event, of course, happened in June of 1977. While I was in the military, when I graduated from high school in 1973, I enlisted in the Air Force for 6 years and remained on active duty from 73 to 79. And I was trained as a medic and an EMT, and spent all of my enlistment at Whiteman Air Force Base. At the time, that was a SAC base, Strategic Air Command base, that had B-52s with nuclear weapons and a squadron of Minutemen II ICBM missiles spread out across the countryside. So that's where I spent those 6 years between 73 and 79. I exited the military in 79 and made my career in the law. And this story would not have been well received by my colleagues in the legal community.
I can sympathize with you on that one, because I'm member of the same club. And yes.
I knew that you would have empathy for me, and I appreciate that. So I waited until I retired. And, you know, in all honesty, I really had no desire or inclination to ever tell this story, speak about it, or write a book until 2012. About 8 months after I had retired, I had some pain in my right knee. And I went to the Veterans Administration emergency room. I get all my care through the VA.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting experience. The October 25th, 2012, the X-ray technician took several shots of my right knee and looked confused and took several more. And she asked me, she said, Mr. Lovelace, do you have a shrapnel wound or something in your leg that can account for a piece of metal or something in your leg? Or ever had a fracture to that leg? And I'm like, no, I never left the States. I've never been in combat. I never had an accident. Never had any problem with that leg. She called for a radiologist who came down and looked at my films. I think you have both of them.
Yes.
And he asked me the same questions. And he did not believe me when I told him I'd never injured that leg. And he says, well, to have these objects buried in your leg, deep in the fascia, under the tissue, would have required a break in the integrity of the skin over the area, and you should have a scar there. And I said, doctor, I don't have a scar there. And he said, oh, yes, you do. It may have been when you were young. You may have just forgotten about it. These things can fade and shift in location from time to time, but there's definitely a scar. So it was kind of a challenge, and he looked at my knee, and then he turned out the lights in the already dark X-ray room and examined my knee with like a black light. Because evidently scar tissue will fluoresce under a black light.
Mm-hmm.
And he was stumped. He really was. He turned the lights back on, and he said, you don't have a scar. And I said, well, doctor, how often is it that you can find a foreign body under the tissue like this without there being a corresponding scar? And he paused for a moment and said, never. He said, I've been a radiologist 23 years. I've never seen anything like this before. And when I asked him the question, how did this get into my leg without leaving a scar? His answer was, by means unknown to medical science. That was his answer. And he was obviously upset by that.
Yes.
But I was more upset because, when I separated from the military in '79, I started running. It was a craze then. It was a fad. It was
yes.
Running was called jogging, and if you think about it, at least in the States, you never saw anyone run on a street or in a park unless they were running away from someone. If you saw someone running, they were on an athletic field or running away from something. But the idea of running in public for exercise was actually a kind of a new concept. You can go and look old photographs and documentary footage from the 50s, 40s, 30s, whatever. You'll not see a single soul out running in the community. So I took to it. I liked it. And I ran for the next 40 years. And I noticed something very odd, and that was that at the 2-mile mark of my run, give or take 50 yards, there would be a spot above my right knee and lateral that would go completely numb.
Mm-hmm.
And I could take a pin and stick it in. It was so numb, and I could, using a pin, delineate its edges, and it was perfectly circular, about the size of a Canadian toonie. I'm not familiar with your currency anymore, but maybe an inch and a quarter in diameter or less.
Mm-hmm.
But and that spot would fade after about 45 minutes. And I asked my doctor about it, and I said, I got the spot that goes numb when I run, and she says, oh yeah, that's probably a histamic reaction. They're common. It's nothing to worry about, and I wouldn't worry about it, and I didn't worry about it. But Charles, when I saw that X-ray, I realized that this thing above my knee, the thing about the size of a fingernail with wires attached to it, lay directly below that spot on my leg that would go numb. And that had an effect on me. I had somewhat come to peace with the idea of having nightmares for 40 years.
Yeah.
But seeing that on my leg reinforced the idea that back in 1977, these things had put their hands on me.
Right. We now need to go back to 1977 then.
Yes. In 1977, I was working in the emergency room as an EMT, driving an ambulance, working with my good friend and coworker. I refer to him in the book as Tobias. And we were co-workers. We worked emergency room midnight shift from 11 till 8 in the morning, and went around and made picked up accident victims, auto accidents, heart attacks, whatever needed immediate medical response on base. We were the first responders, and we liked our job. We liked working the night shift. We were both taking classes in the evening at the Extension University on campus. And my friend was a amateur astronomer who was just absolutely just enthralled with the night sky. He lived to watch the night sky. And, in retrospect, I wonder where that obsession came from. But one night his idea was about 2 a.m. He said, I've been thinking, I've got an idea. Why don't we go camping? And I said, Toby, are you nuts, man? We'd never been camping. I mean, I was from St. Louis City. He was from Flint, Michigan. Neither one of us had ever been camping, And it's not rocket science, but it's just something we'd never done, never thought about.
Yeah.
But I had a new camera, and I was really dying to take some photographs of wildlife. He was interested in seeking a piece of high ground where he could do some stargazing and without light pollution. So he said, I've got the perfect place for us to go. It's called Devil's Den State Park. It's in northwest Arkansas, about a 6-hour drive. And, over the course of a couple of weeks, he said this early in the season before it got warm, and over the course of a few weeks, the idea kind of grew on me. And we, come June of 1977, we piled all our stuff in the car and made the drive down. And when we got there, we made the decision that we were going to dodge the campgrounds and find our own spot.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because, you stay in a campground, there would be people on either side of you, and children and other undesirables running around. And we didn't want that. We wanted to be, we felt like Lewis and Clark, right? We felt like great explorers. So we dodged the ranger station, didn't buy a camping permit, and took a road that led a paved road that deteriorated to gravel, that deteriorated to just 2 ruts in the road. And we drove until we found a chain across the road with a sign that said strictly no admittance, kind of an intimidating sign. But the chain across the road was fastened to a post on the left side, and on the opposite side of the road, there was another post. And what they'd done is just taken the chain and hooked it like a noose with a padlock, and just draped it over a nail on that other post. So I said, well, it looks like we can't go any further. And my friend is like, no, wait a minute. I got this covered. He hops out, and sure enough, he just lifts up the chain off the nail of the post and drops it and lets it fall. And we drove in, and oh my God, we felt on top of the world. We felt elated, and took a path. We could see some high ground in the distance, and in retrospect, it almost seemed like my friend knew where to go.
Yeah.
Suggesting, why don't you make a right here? Why don't you make a left here? And I give him credit for having an unerring sense of direction, but it was kind of weird. And we drove up the road took an incline, and we drove up, and we crested this hill into this beautiful meadow full of late blooming wildflowers and grass that was a little bit less than knee high. And it was just awesome. I mean, we looked at one another, and we were awestruck. It was a beautiful I call it in the book, I call it a meadow. And it was just a big open field elevated on a plateau in the middle of this thick forest all around us. And it was absolutely gorgeous. So we thought, this has got to be the place. And we stopped the car. We went for a hike. I'll skip some of the odd things that happened on the hike, but we set up our camp just before dusk, just before the sun went down, and built a fire. And, we did all the fun things that you do when you go camping. And I recall, telling my friend, I said, I could see why people like this. This is pleasant. And, he couldn't help but gloat and say, yeah, I told you, I told you that it'd be cool. And we really had a kind of a pleasant evening. And we were talking, and there came a lull in our conversation. And Charles, this sounds cliche, I know. This sounds like, right out of a movie or something, but I'm not making this up. I'm totally truthful and totally serious. And that was that the night sounds of the forest stopped. It went completely quiet. And it unnerved me. Just, a few minutes earlier, while we were talking, we had to raise our voice so we could hear one another. We were seated maybe 10 feet away on inflatable air mattresses, just kind of kicked back by the fire. And it went dead silent. And not only did it go quiet, even the breeze that we had enjoyed earlier was gone. Mm-hmm. It was still. And that stillness genuinely unnerved me. And I asked my friend, like he's going to know, I asked him, I said, is this normal, man? It's quiet out here. And he's like, he blew it off and said, oh, yeah, man, we've been making a lot of noise. The crickets, the tree frogs, all that stuff, it'll come back. Just wait, it'll come back. But I wasn't, had I been by myself, I'd have packed up my car and gone home, be honest with you. I was that unnerved by the thing. But we kicked back and we're talking, and I'm just trying to get back into the zone of relaxed and comfortable. And my friend had turned his head to the left, and he asked me, he said, Terry, were those lights there before? And I had to lean back. I'm looking over his shoulder to the left, my left, his left. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And sure enough, on the horizon, and we're in a very remote area. I mean, we are, miles away from anything. And on the horizon, there sat three little stars in a tight triangle, and they sat just above the horizon. And they were too far off the ground to have been lights from a parking lot, a train, anything like that. And they were obviously in the air, and we knew no aircraft that had that kind of light configuration because, like I say, it was a tight little perfect triangle.
Yeah.
Each point of light was about as luminescent as the North Star, so it was pretty bright. And this was a cloudless night, absolutely cloudless and beautiful with a trillion stars outside. It was just a gorgeous night. And we're watching this thing and we're debating, well, what is it? And we're talking back and forth, and then it rotates. It finally moved, and it rotated like it were on an axis. It made about a 3/4 turn and then stopped and then started an ascent into the sky. And it climbed straight up with the apex of the triangle pointing up. Mm-hmm. And the higher it got, the faster it moved. And we could see from the starlight that made the sky blue, we could see that inside these 3 points of light, it was jet black. So we knew that this was one solid object and not three objects, moving in unison.
Yeah.
And this thing tumbled, and it would do turns and somersaults where the one point of light at the apex would go up and then turn around, and then we'd see 3 lights, 2 lights, and then it would change position with the apex pointed down. It was tumbling. And I don't know where it came from, but I had the distinct impression that this thing was moving with purpose. It wasn't just tumbling. It was doing something. It was intent. It was moving with purpose. Mm-hmm. And it reached a ceiling. I don't know how high, but pretty high up in the air, and then began a descent. And as it came down, it became very clear that this thing was headed in our direction. And it's that time that, I had that period of time where I felt totally unnerved and concerned about this thing, to kind of excited about it. And as it began descending and headed toward our campsite, I felt this feeling of calm wash over me. I wouldn't call it apathy, but it was kind of a disinterest. It was weird. I felt more like an observer than a participant in this whole thing. And my friend must have been in the same frame of mind, and he admitted so afterward, because, there's hardly a word spoken between us. We're just just there watching this thing play out. And that feeling of sedation swept over me in waves, and it was kind of a pleasant sensation. It felt like almost like you received medication before surgery or something that makes you kind of calm and in a twilight state. And that's kind of what this was like. And I was keenly interested in watching the thing, and had no fear whatsoever. All the fear had left me. This thing dropped down low, and we watched it from our vantage point. We were at an elevated point, and we could see the forest below us for a great distance. And the starlight was so bright, we saw this triangular shaped shadow move across the floor of the forest, actually the top of the forest, as it headed in our direction. And it was definitely headed toward us. And I think, there was no conversation anymore. The only conversation I remember was my friend saying, it's really moving now, or something to that effect. And I think I replied, yeah, it's coming our way. But that was it. Our response to this thing was totally inappropriate. And in retrospect, over the years, I really believe that we were under some kind of control by this thing. Mm-hmm. Our emotions, at least, were controlled. It was, our response was definitely out of character. And while we watched, this thing descended, and it was enormous. It was, I describe it as being a city block in length, on each leg of the triangle, with lights on the tips of on the point, on all 3 points. And it was deep. It wasn't thin. It was deep. It was like 5 stories tall. So as it came to a halt at about 3,000 feet over our heads, the enormity of this thing was just, it should have been overwhelming, but it wasn't. It was just there. And it had stopped, and all was still quiet. And from directly underneath this thing, there came a beam of light. And it was a visible beam of light, about the diameter of a softball. And it had that quality to it that makes it like a high-power searchlight that cuts through fog. Mm-hmm. you see a visible column of light. That's what this was like. But there was no fog. It was just the visible white light. And it came down from the center of the ship, again, about 3,000 feet over our heads. And just like someone flipped a switch, and it landed square in the middle of our campfire. And we looked at it, and we looked at one another. But again, there was no excitement. There was a little bit of interest, but not even a great deal of that. And we watched this thing, and it only stayed for about a minute. And then it, as quickly as it appeared, it turned off. And immediately, in its stead, there came a laser like light. Now, lasers were kind of a new concept in 1977. I'd seen them on TV, but I'd never seen a laser beam, in real life.
Yeah.
And this laser beam came down, and what it would do is it would land on our campsite and stay in one spot for maybe a tenth of a second, and then turn off in a millisecond, reappear in another location. And it did this, as I said, about 10 times a second. So it gave the illusion that this light was just dancing all over our campsite. And I remember thinking, this thing's scanning us. I don't know where that came from, but maybe it was obvious. I don't know. But I remember thinking, yeah, it's checking us out. And that light struck me in the chest a couple times. I didn't feel anything. It struck my car, the tent, the campsite. And that stayed for about 3 minutes until it had totally scanned everything there was, I guess, to scan. And then as abruptly as the other one turned off, this just switched off. And we sat there in this dead silence. And I remember thinking that my buddy was wrong, that the crickets, the tree frogs, the sounds of the night did not come back. The only thing we could hear was, maybe a crackle from the fire now and then. And even that, we had enjoyed a nice breeze earlier, and the breeze was gone. And the stillness had returned. But by this time, I was under some type of control or sedation because I wasn't afraid. Mm-hmm. I was just an observer. And after about 15 minutes, my friend stood up and said, well, I guess show's over. And he dragged his air mattress and headed for the tent. And I felt, sleepy, absolutely sedated sleepy. Now, I'm 22 years old. I'm used to working a night shift. I'm used to staying up all night. I should not have been sleepy. Tired maybe, but absolutely not sleepy. And I followed my friend, and I threw my air mattress in the tent after he did. And I didn't bother to remove my boots. That would be an important point later. Mm-hmm. I didn't bother to undress in any way. I just fell on this air mattress. And my friend was already snoring softly. And I fell face down, and I was out. I was just out.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
We calculated that about 4 hours had passed. I woke up with these lights coming through the canvas of the tent, and they were brilliant. They were incredibly bright, and they were white and yellow and light green, and they lit the inside of that tent up. I mean, like a ball stadium at night. It was just, you could read by it. It was so bright. Mm-hmm. And I'm confused. I don't have my wits about me. So I kind of get on my elbows and sit up, and I noticed that my boots are undone. And I thought, that's odd. And I took my boots off to straighten things out. That my socks were on sideways. And, one of the things they teach you in the military is to take good care of your feet.
Mm-hmm.
So I would never have done that. And like I say, I'm certain that when I went to bed, when I fell on that air mattress inside the tent and went to sleep, my boots were on and laced up to the top. And now here they're unlaced. And I had to take a moment and, correct that and lace my boots up. And when I did, from my peripheral vision, in the flashes of light, I could see that my friend Toby is on his knees, and he's peering outside this flap of the tent, looking at something. And in one of these particularly bright flashes of light, I could see the right side of his face, and there were tracks of tears down his face. And it showed up. The tear mark showed up. He's black. I'm white, and I could see on his skin these tear tracks were very visible when the white light flashed, and that scared me. At that moment, all of that feeling of calm and sedation left me, and I was just scared. And I couldn't understand what on earth could move this man to cry. So I'm thinking, I'm still confused with these lights, and I'm thinking, could these lights be like the overhead lights of a park ranger's truck or something? What's causing this light? And then I could hear a low droning sound, like a mechanical sound. A sound that's like if you ever stood next to a big piece of industrial machinery, the sound is not so much loud as it is powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's what I heard. Yeah. And I thought, a park ranger running a generator in a truck, that doesn't make any sense. And I got to my knees and I'm like, oh yeah, we're camping. That's right. And I'm trying to claw my way out of this fog. And as I said, I'm already afraid, having seen my friend in tears. And I spoke up and I asked him, I'm like, Toby, what is it? What's out there, Toby? What is it park rangers? What are you looking at? What's out there? And he turned to me and put his fingers across his lips, kind of in the universal sign to be quiet.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm curious. And I got to my knees, and I noticed that I hurt. I hurt all over. And when I got to my knees, I pulled back the flap of my tent on the right side, and I could see in this meadow, I saw two things. And that is this craft, the size of a medical building that was hanging over our heads at 3,000 feet when we went to bed, had descended. And it's now just about 30 feet over our heads. And the enormity of it really sank home. When it went from 3,000 feet to just 30 feet, you could see that it was just an intimidatingly large structure. It was just enormous. And the second thing I noticed was walking around in this field, I saw 12 or 15 what I first took to be children. And I asked my friend, I said, Toby, man, what are these kids doing out here? We're in a remote area in the middle of the night. Why are these kids out here? And he said, Terry, man, those ain't no little kids. They took us and they hurt us. Don't you remember? And when he said that, I had flashes of memory of being inside this thing. Now, understand, I've never had a clear linear memory of what happened over those 4 hours. I only have bits and pieces. But the bits and pieces I have are terrifying. And they've been the subject of my nightmares for 40 years. And we watch these things. And, when he said they're not human beings, I looked closer and I could see that they had heads that were disproportionately large to their body, thin torso, thin limbs, disproportionately long, and they walk with a really distinctive gait. They walk like their feet were sore, and they were all paired up in twos and threes, maybe 15 of them total. And they were just meandering around this meadow, just like they were tourists or something. They didn't appear to be conversing with one another, but their heads were turning, and they were just kind of checking things out. And after about, I don't know the passage of time, but I'd say, half an hour or less of watching these guys and hoping that they wouldn't come in our direction, from underneath this craft, there came a light. And it was that same quality of light, that visible white light that we saw that landed in our campfire. Only this was a wide column of light. It was about 30 feet wide. It was about as wide as this thing was high off the ground. And it was a column. It was round. And these little guys would meander in pairs and threes into this light. And when they did, they just dissolved. They just dissolved into nothing. Yeah. And we watched them. And they took their time. They, weren't in any hurry. But they would walk over and meander into this light and just dissolve. At this point, we're both terrified. And my friend is hyperventilating. And I'm telling him, Toby, man, you got to get control of your breathing. You're hyperventilating. And eventually he did. But I can't stress how terrified we were. And after the last two of these little guys disappeared, the lights shut off. And then that droning mechanical noise that we'd heard, which we'd heard for some time, you kind of get used to the sound, and then it was quiet again. Mm-hmm. And the lights shut off, and the lights on the points of each triangle, each point of the triangle, changed in color. They had been yellow, green, and white, and now they switched to all white. And the thing took off, and we watched it take off. And it didn't take off like a rocket. It took off like a hot air balloon. Mm-hmm. It just lifted straight up and made a turn and continued to rise. And we flipped over onto our backs and watched it, go from 3 points of light to a single point of light till it was gone. And it was still deathly quiet. The noises of the forest had not returned. And we sat there, I think we were just paralyzed with fear. And I guess we sat there for 30 minutes. And finally, my friend spoke up and said, "We got to get out of here." And, it was only a piece of canvas over my head. That's all, just this piece of canvas. But I didn't want to leave that tent. Mm-hmm. I felt like I had cover, I felt to leave that tent, I'd be vulnerable. And, to this day, I do not like to be alone or with another person in an open space. If I, rather than cut across an open field, to get somewhere, I'll walk, a mile out of my way to go around the periphery so that I'm not in the open and exposed. That was something new, and that's still with me today. That this experience changed a couple of things in my life. Obviously, I had the nightmares that I talk about, mm-hmm. and those are still there. They're come back on occasion, and but they're horrific in that when one of these nightmares start, I can't wake myself up. It seems like the thing has to play out, and then I'll wake up. And I was bothered about a year after the event. I became bothered with what I called intrusive thoughts, and that is, I would be, doing something, reading a book, I would be at work, and thinking about something else, and then without warning, I'd have flashes and bits and pieces, memory of being inside this craft.
Mm-hmm.
And I found out later, I was tested in the late 1980s and diagnosed with PTSD, quote, etiology unknown.
Mm-hmm.
So I took the test, and the test showed PTSD, but I wasn't about to tell anybody what I saw because, I was afraid they'd label me as delusional, you know?
Yeah.
So, another odd thing before I get into the inside of the ship, and that is that both of our watches quit running. We both wore wind-up watches. In 1977, there were no quartz watches, or watches, and both of our watches had stopped right at about 2:40. And my watch was relatively new, and it was a fairly expensive watch. I wish I'd kept it. I was told later by a watch salesman where I had to replace it that he said, well, have you been around a large piece of machinery? He says, a large magnetic force can cause the watches to stop. And, I had, for about a year after this event, I had trouble wearing a watch. I could wear one for about maybe 60 days, and it would stop. Now, that eventually faded, and I was able to wear a mechanical watch again. There were some after effects from this. I think I talk in the book about going Christmas shopping with my wife one year. I think it was 1987, and we were in a mall, in a crowded mall at Christmas time, and there was a storefront window that had naked mannequins from the head up, from the waist up.
Mm-hmm.
It was going to be some type of women's clothing store, and they were just setting the thing up.
Yeah.
And I walk past it from my peripheral vision. I saw these things, and I turned and I looked at those mannequins, and the sight of the mannequins, for some reason, threw me into a panic attack. And I had to leave. I had tracked my wife down, and I said, we got to go. I got to get out of here. And that was the sight of those still make me uneasy to this day. So I guess I was going to explain the few memories that I have, because like I say, I've never had a clear linear memory, but I have bits and pieces. And when my Fred made the comment about the little guys not being human beings, that brought back flashes of memory. And I recall, and I can tell you what I recall about being inside the ship. And it's been the repeated subject of my nightmares for years. And that was that I recall that we were in the ship together, and we were frozen. We couldn't move. We were paralyzed. And we were in a standing position, and they had stripped us. And I had all of my clothing, my boots were held in my arms. And I couldn't move anything except my eyes. So my eyes are darting all over, and I'm trying to take in this place where I'm at. Now, I don't know if they took us inside the ship and took us somewhere else, because the inside of the ship was many times larger than the exterior would lead you to believe. Mm-hmm. It was enormous. It was. Well, it looked like maybe a medical building from the outside. On the inside, it looked like a massive stadium. And that made no sense. So I'm not for certain that that's where we were, but we were someplace. And we were standing on a big open atrium, and there were different levels of walkways all around us, and there was a lot of activity. I saw a golf cart-like thing without wheels moving, and there were the the little gray guys like you see. They're ubiquitous. The little gray aliens, like 2.5 feet tall, and I have a theory about them that I'll share with you. And after watching them for a while, I'm left with the impression that they were not living sentient beings like you and I. I think they are. I think they're manufactured. I really do. At least the ones that I saw, and there may be, dozens of different varieties. I don't know, but the ones that we saw, I think were more robotic in nature. Maybe some type of artificial intelligence, quantum mechanic, nanotechnology, who knows, some kind of biological material. Like I say, they were definitely alive, but not sentient in the way that you and I are, self-aware. They were just purpose-driven, and they were running all over the place. And the inside of the ship was incredibly bright.
That concludes the first part of our interview with Terry Lovelace. We'll be back with the second part next week. In the meantime, you can find Terry's book on Amazon. It's called Incident at Devil's Canyon, a true story. Time for a bit more practical magic, and as promised at the outset, here's a little spell to create a safe travel charm, a little good luck charm. And of course, this time of the year, when the weather's getting a little bit better, but you can still get bargains on holidays because it's relatively the low season for travel, outside the school holidays and all that, might well want to go off on a holiday. But what if you find it a bit worrying, a bit stressful? And indeed, an awful lot of people get very stressed preparing to go on holidays. So here's a little charm to make, which you should wear this charm or carry it in your pocket. And when things get a little bit stressful or overwhelming during your holiday, or preparing for it, or travelling to the airport and waiting for the plane, etc., just take out this charm and feel it in your fingers, and you'll feel more relaxed. Now, what do you need? Well, you basically need a small piece of hematite, that's sometimes called iron oxide, or an amethyst stone. And you also need a silver coin. Now, if you're in America, it'll be a silver dime. If you're in the UK, it'll be something like a shilling or a sixpence, or even an old threepenny bit. Now, you'll have noticed I've used the old names for the currency. That's because most modern currency from 1947 onwards contains no silver, and the key is the silver element. It's the same for the American dimes. The older they are, the more silver they're going to contain. In the UK, for example, before 1920, they were almost solid silver. And from 1921 to 1946, they were 50% silver. So I say, rummage around somewhere for an old coin, a shilling, a sixpence, or one of those old silver threepenny bits. You can pick them up relatively cheaply in junk shops and things. You should also take something that's local and natural from the vicinity of your home. So it could be something like an acorn or a pine cone, or it could be a pebble. Bearing in mind some countries are very strict on taking plant-type goods in and out of into their countries. Probably skip the acorn and pine cone and just go for a pebble. I say it doesn't need to be a special pebble, just something from your garden or your drive. And the final element you need is a small slip of paper on which you write the word home. Doesn't need to be special paper again, doesn't need to be a special coloured ink, but just write the word home on it. So these are the elements. The hematite or the amethyst, I say you can pick those up at esoteric shops, gemstone shops very cheaply. A silver coin, an antique one is best. Something natural from the vicinity of your home, And finally, you need a 3-inch square of blue fabric. It can be silk, linen or cotton or any other material, but a natural fabric like that. And basically you place in the center of this silk square or fabric square, you place the paper, and on the paper you place the stone, the silver coin and the gemstone, say hematite or amethyst, and you fold them all together and make a little bundle out of the fabric, and then with a long piece of ribbon, preferably red ribbon, tie it up. However, the ribbon does need to be long enough to work as a necklace so that you can hang it around your neck. You might not want to do that if you're a man, in which case don't quite need so much fabric in the ribbon and you can keep it in your pocket. And also worth noting, on a very practical, mundane note, that if you're going through metal detectors at airports and the like, the silver coins might set them off, so you should be prepared to put it in the hand-checked items before you go through the scanner. So that's it. How to create a little charm to encourage you to have a safe and enjoyable travel, safe and enjoyable holiday, something to remove the stress associated with the travelling. Have fun. And that's it. Once again, we're out of time. Looking out of the studio windows, it seems that spring has sprung. The sun is shining and the primroses are out. And on my travels yesterday, a crow flew overhead, carrying the largest branch I've ever seen a crow carry. On its way to build a nest, I presume. That, or it was the Celtic battle crow goddess Morrigan on her way to smite down one of her foes. Just remains for me to say thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me again same time next week. Till then, this is Charles Christian saying stay well, stay weird, and stay different.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.